Sometimes you experience something so surprising that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, like finding out that your neighbor, who never waves back, actually bakes cookies for the entire block every Christmas, or discovering that the guy who cuts you off in traffic every morning volunteers at an animal shelter on weekends, or learning that the person who always takes the last coffee at work without making a new pot actually runs a charity that provides free meals to homeless veterans. Last week, I had one of those moments when I learned that Republican lawmakers in Indiana actually told Donald Trump no. And I mean really told him no. Not the kind of polite, diplomatic, we'll take that under advisement that politicians usually use when they want to avoid confrontation. Not that we share your concerns, but have different priorities, deflection that's become standard in political discourse. This was a straight-up, unambiguous rejection of a direct request from the leader of their own party. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering if I've been hitting the cooking wine again, or if this is some elaborate setup for a joke about alternate dimensions. But I assure you, I am stone cold sober, and this is happening in our timeline. On December 11th, 2025, the Indiana Republican-controlled state legislature defied direct pressure from President Trump and rejected his demands for a newly gerrymandered congressional map that would have guaranteed more Republican seats in Congress. And honestly, my first reaction was to check if hell had frozen over, because in the past 8 years, Republicans saying no to Trump has been about as common as finding a unicorn in your backyard playing poker with Bigfoot. It just doesn't happen. Yet here we are in a world where Indiana Republicans looked at a personal request from the leader of their party and essentially said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Mr. President." Now, you might be wondering why this matters. After all, it's just one state legislature making one decision about electoral maps. But here's the thing. This isn't just about redistricting. This is about something much bigger. It's about the fundamental question of whether Donald Trump is still the undisputed king of the Republican Party, or whether cracks are finally starting to show in what once seemed like an unbreakable loyalty. To understand why this Indiana situation is so significant, we need to talk about gerrymandering. For those of you who might not be familiar, gerrymandering is the practice of drawing electoral district boundaries to give one political party an unfair advantage. It's named after Elbridge Gerry, a Massachusetts governor who approved a redistricting plan in 1812 that was so obviously partisan that one district was said to look like a salamander, hence gerrymander. The practice itself is about as old as American democracy. Politicians have been trying to rig the game in their favor since literally the beginning. But what's happened in recent decades is that gerrymandering has become incredibly sophisticated. With modern computer technology and detailed voter data, politicians can now draw maps with surgical precision, creating districts that are virtually guaranteed to elect their preferred candidates. And the results have been dramatic. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, extreme gerrymandering has given Republicans a significant advantage in multiple states, sometimes allowing them to win majorities in state legislatures even when they receive fewer total votes. In Wisconsin, for example, Republicans have consistently controlled the state assembly despite Democrats winning more votes statewide. The same pattern has played out in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and several other states. This isn't just a theoretical problem. It has real consequences for governance. When politicians can essentially choose their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians, it reduces accountability and can lead to more extreme positions on both sides. Representatives from safely gerrymandered districts don't have to worry about appealing to moderate voters, so they can cater exclusively to their party's base. And Donald Trump, he's been a huge fan of this process. Throughout his presidency and beyond, he's consistently pushed for more aggressive gerrymandering to benefit Republicans. He's made personal calls to governors, sent surrogates to pressure state legislators, and used his political influence to try to maximize Republican representation in Congress. Which brings us back to Indiana. When the 2020 census results came in, it was time for states to redraw their congressional districts. Indiana Republicans already controlled most of the state's congressional seats, but Trump wanted them to go further. According to multiple reports, he personally lobbied state lawmakers to create an even more aggressive gerrymander that would essentially guarantee Republican control of additional seats. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Indiana Republicans didn't just politely decline, they actively rejected Trump's plan. State House Speaker Todd Huston publicly stated that the legislature would prioritize fair and transparent redistricting over partisan advantage. State Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray echoed this sentiment, saying that Indiana Republicans would focus on good government rather than political gamesmanship. And when Trump threatened to primary any Republican who didn't support his plan, something remarkable happened. Nothing. The threats that once sent Republican politicians scrambling for cover were met with silence. Not compliance, not apologies, not desperate attempts to find a compromise. Just silence, followed by a firm no. But Indiana isn't the only place where we're seeing this phenomenon. In recent months, Trump has faced resistance from Republican officials across the country on various issues. In Georgia, Republican Governor Brian Kemp has continued to push back against Trump's claims about the 2020 election. In Arizona, Republican senators have voted against several Trump-backed initiatives. Even in Florida, Ron DeSantis has occasionally charted his own course rather than automatically falling in line with Trump's wishes. What's particularly fascinating is that this resistance isn't coming from the usual suspects. These aren't the Lincoln Project Republicans or the moderate never-Trumpers who were always skeptical of his leadership. These are mainstream Republican officials who supported Trump in previous elections and generally align with his policy positions. They're not rejecting Trumpism, they're rejecting Trump's absolute authority. According to recent polling data, Trump's approval rating among Republicans has remained relatively high, but there are some telling details in the numbers. While about 77% of Republicans still view Trump favorably, that's down from the 85 to 90% range he enjoyed during his presidency. More significantly, when asked whether Trump should have the final say on important party decisions, only 52% of Republicans agree. That's a dramatic shift from the near universal deference he once commanded. The economic numbers might explain some of this shift. Despite campaign promises, many Trump administration policies haven't delivered the dramatic improvements that were promised. Inflation remains stubbornly high in many areas, wage growth has been uneven, and several high-profile trade deals have failed to materialize. When voters start feeling economic pain, they tend to become less tolerant of political drama and more focused on practical results. Dr. Sarah Patterson, a political scientist at Northwestern University who studies party dynamics, explains it this way. When a political leader's mystique starts to fade, party members begin to remember that they have their own political interests to protect. Trump's power was always based on the perception that he was a winner who could deliver electoral victories. When that perception starts to crack, politicians start making their own calculations, and the cracks are becoming more visible. In Virginia, Republican Glenn Youngkin won the governor's race in 2021 by explicitly distancing himself from Trump while still appealing to Trump voters. In Georgia, Governor Brian Kemp won re-election in 2022 despite Trump's vocal opposition. In several recent special elections, Trump-endorsed candidates have lost in districts that Republicans should have won easily. Perhaps more importantly, many Republican donors are starting to hedge their bets. According to campaign finance reports, several major Republican donors who previously gave exclusively to Trump-endorsed candidates are now spreading their money around to other Republican politicians. When the money starts flowing in different directions, politicians notice. But let's talk about what this means for Trump personally. Because if you've been following his career, you know that his entire political brand is built on the image of being a strong leader who gets what he wants. He's the guy who wrote The Art of the Deal, who built his reputation on being able to pressure, cajole, and negotiate his way to victory. So what happens when that reputation starts to crumble? What happens when other politicians stop taking his calls seriously? When his endorsements stop carrying the same weight? When his threats stop inducing fear? Well, we're starting to find out. And Trump's response has been, let's call it predictable. When Indiana Republicans refused to bend to his will, Trump initially tried to increase the pressure. He threatened primary challenges, organized rallies in Indiana, and mobilized his social media following to put pressure on state lawmakers. But here's where it gets interesting. The usual tactics didn't work. The social media pile-on that once terrified Republican politicians was largely ignored by Indiana legislators. The threat of primary challenges that used to send Republicans scrambling to make amends was met with what can only be described as a collective shrug. Even more remarkably, when Trump allies started calling Indiana Republicans rhinos, Republicans in name only, other Republicans actually came to their defense. When that didn't work, he moved to Plan B, claiming that the whole thing was actually his idea. In a series of Truth Social posts, Trump suggested that he had actually advised Indiana Republicans to be careful and thoughtful about redistricting, and that their decision was consistent with his guidance. It was a remarkable display of revisionist history. even by Trump standards. The problem with this approach, of course, is that in the age of screenshots and archived social media posts, it's pretty hard to convincingly rewrite history in real time. Multiple news outlets had already reported on Trump's initial pressure campaign, complete with quotes from Republican sources describing his specific demands for more aggressive gerrymandering. But here's the thing about power. It's often more about perception than reality. Trump's political strength was never based on constitutional authority or institutional position. It was based on the belief among Republican politicians that crossing him would be political suicide. Once that belief starts to weaken, the whole edifice becomes surprisingly fragile. And we're seeing this play out in real time. When Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema announced she would leave the Democratic Party to become an independent, many people expected Trump to try to recruit her to the Republican side. Instead, Arizona Republicans made it clear they weren't interested in Trump's input on the matter. They would make their own decisions about potential candidates and endorsements. In Ohio, Republican Governor Mike DeWine has consistently refused to endorse Trump's preferred candidates in Republican primaries, instead backing more moderate Republicans who he believes can win general elections. When Trump criticized DeWine publicly, other Ohio Republicans rallied around their governor rather than around Trump. Even more tellingly, several Republican governors have started coordinating their policy agendas without consulting Trump or his team. The Republican Governors Association, which once deferred to Trump on major strategic decisions, now operates largely independently of his input. This shift represents something historically significant. Political parties in America have always had internal tensions and disagreements, but they usually resolve them through established processes and hierarchies. What we're seeing now is different, a fundamental questioning of whether Trump should be the unquestioned leader of the Republican Party. And if you look at American political history, this kind of intra-party challenge to a sitting president is actually quite rare. Usually, political parties rally around their president, even when they have private disagreements about strategy or tactics. The last time we saw this level of open defiance within a party was probably during the final years of Richard Nixon's presidency, when Republican senators began distancing themselves from the president as the Watergate scandal unfolded. But there's a key difference here. Nixon faced legal and constitutional crises that threatened the integrity of his presidency. Trump, by contrast, is facing political and strategic disagreements about the future direction of the party. In some ways, that makes the current situation even more remarkable, because it suggests that Republicans are willing to challenge Trump not because they have to, but because they want to. And it's not just about Trump personally, it's about what kind of party the Republicans want to be going forward. Do they want to be the party of Trump forever tied to his particular style and priorities? Or do they want to be a broader conservative movement that can attract voters beyond Trump's core base? The Indiana redistricting fight crystallizes this tension perfectly. Trump's approach was purely transactional. Draw the maps to maximize Republican seats regardless of fairness or public opinion. The Indiana Republicans' approach was more strategic. Maintain credibility as good government advocates while still advancing conservative principles. Both approaches have their merits from a political standpoint. Trump's way delivers immediate tactical advantages. The Indiana way potentially builds longer-term credibility and appeals to a broader range of voters. But they're fundamentally incompatible approaches, and the Republican Party is going to have to choose which direction it wants to go. What makes this moment particularly interesting is that it's happening at a time when Trump is supposed to be at the height of his power. He's the sitting president, he controls the executive branch, and Republicans control both houses of Congress. This should be the moment when his influence over the party is strongest, not when it starts to weaken. But politics is funny that way. Sometimes the very moment when someone appears most powerful is actually when their power begins to decline. When you're president, every decision you make has real consequences. Every policy that doesn't work out becomes your responsibility. Every promise that goes unfulfilled becomes a mark against your credibility. And Trump made a lot of promises. He promised to bring manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest. He promised to fix healthcare. He promised to reduce the deficit. He promised to drain the swamp. Some of these promises were kept, others were not, and still others were only partially fulfilled. But the gap between promise and delivery creates space for other Republicans to ask whether there might be better ways to advance conservative goals. The generational aspect of this shift is also worth noting. Many of the Republicans who are starting to assert independence from Trump are younger politicians who weren't in office during his initial rise to power. They didn't experience the 2016 campaign or the early days of his presidency when crossing Trump seemed like certain political death. These younger Republicans have their own political ambitions, their own base of support, and their own ideas about how to win elections. They've watched Trump's approach work in some contexts and fail in others, and they're making their own calculations about what strategies will be most effective going forward. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida is probably the most visible example of this phenomenon. DeSantis initially aligned himself closely with Trump and benefited from Trump's endorsement in his gubernatorial race. But as DeSantis has built his own political brand and gained national recognition, he's become more willing to chart his own course. When Trump criticized DeSantis' handling of COVID-19, DeSantis didn't back down or apologize. He defended his record and suggested that his approach had been more effective than the federal government's. When Trump hinted that DeSantis should stay out of the 2024 presidential race, DeSantis essentially ignored the suggestion and continued building his national profile. This dynamic isn't limited to high-profile politicians like DeSantis. Across the country, Republican state legislators, county officials, and local party leaders are starting to make decisions based on their own political calculations rather than automatic deference to Trump's preferences. In some cases, this means moving in a more moderate direction to appeal to suburban voters who may be skeptical of Trump. In other cases, it means embracing conservative positions that go beyond Trump's comfort zone. But in all cases, it represents a shift away from the centralized control that Trump once exercised over the Republican Party. The implications of this shift extend far beyond internal Republican Party dynamics. If Trump's grip on the party continues to weaken, it could fundamentally change the landscape of American politics. A Republican Party that's less tied to Trump's personal brand might be more appealing to moderate voters who support conservative policies but are uncomfortable with Trump's style. It might also create space for policy debates within the Republican Party that have been suppressed during the Trump era. Questions about the proper role of government, the balance between free markets and worker protections, and America's role in the world could all receive fresh attention if Republicans feel freer to express views that diverge from Trump's positions. But here's the thing we have to remember. Political change is rarely linear. The fact that some Republicans are asserting independence from Trump right now doesn't necessarily mean that this trend will continue or accelerate. Political coalitions can shift quickly, and Trump has shown repeatedly that he's capable of reasserting control when his position is challenged. It's also worth noting that Trump still commands significant loyalty among the Republican base. Recent polling shows that while his support among Republican officials may be softening, rank-and-file Republican voters still largely support him. Any Republican politician who moves too far away from Trump risks alienating voters who remain committed to his leadership. The Indiana redistricting case is significant precisely because it represents a test of these competing dynamics. By rejecting Trump's demands, Indiana Republicans are betting that they can maintain their political standing without his full support. If they're successful, if they win their next elections and maintain their influence within the party, it could encourage other Republicans to take similar stands. But if Trump is able to successfully primary Indiana Republicans who crossed him, or if their defiance leads to electoral losses, it would send a very different message to other Republicans considering similar moves. What's particularly fascinating about this moment is how it mirrors broader patterns in American political history. Political parties are always evolving, always dealing with tensions between different factions and competing visions for the future. The Republican Party has gone through major transformations before, from the party of Lincoln to the party of Reagan to the party of Trump, and it's entirely possible that we're witnessing the beginning of another transformation. The question is what comes next? Will Republicans move toward a post-Trump conservatism that emphasizes policy over personality? Will they double down on Trump-style populism, but with different leaders? Will the party split into competing factions? Or will Trump find a way to reassert control and bring the rebels back into line? I don't have a crystal ball, and anyone who claims to know exactly how this will play out is probably overconfident. But what I can say is that the Indiana redistricting fight represents something we haven't seen much of in recent years. Republicans putting institutional considerations ahead of personal loyalty to Trump. Whether that represents a temporary aberration or the beginning of a larger trend remains to be seen. But for those of us who care about democratic institutions and the health of our political system, it's worth watching carefully. Because when political parties start prioritizing governing over grievance, when they choose long-term credibility over short-term advantage, when they're willing to say no to their own leaders, when those leaders ask them to go too far, well, that's usually a sign that democracy is working the way it's supposed to. So here we are in December 2025, witnessing something that many people thought was impossible. Republicans telling Donald Donald Trump? No. Not because they've stopped being conservative, not because they've joined the resistance, but because they've decided that their responsibilities as elected officials sometimes require them to put principle ahead of party loyalty. And here's what I find most encouraging about this development. It suggests that our democratic institutions might be more resilient than many of us feared. For years, political scientists and democracy experts have worried about the erosion of democratic norms, the increasing polarization of our political system, and the tendency of politicians to put party loyalty ahead of institutional responsibility. But the Indiana redistricting fight suggests that even in our highly polarized environment, there are still politicians who are willing to prioritize good governance over partisan advantage. There are still elected officials who believe that their first responsibility is to their constituents and their institutions, not to any individual political leader. It's a small thing, really, one state legislature making one decision about electoral maps. But sometimes small things can have big consequences. Sometimes the first crack in a dam leads to a flood. Sometimes one person saying no gives others the courage to do the same. And sometimes, just sometimes, democracy finds a way to surprise us all. The story of Trump versus his own party is still being written, and we don't know how it ends. But the Indiana chapter suggests that the ending might be more interesting and more hopeful than many of us dared to imagine. Because ultimately, that's what democracy is supposed to be about. Elected officials who are accountable to their constituents, not to any one person or faction. It's about institutions that can check and balance each other, even when, especially when, it's politically inconvenient to do so. And it's about the possibility that even in our most polarized moments, there are still people willing to choose principle over politics, whether this represents the beginning of a new chapter in American politics or just a brief interlude remains to be seen. But for now, at least, we can take some comfort in knowing that when push came to shove, some Republicans remembered that their loyalty belongs to the Constitution and their constituents, not to any individual politician, even if that politician happens to be the president.